Good afternoon. Welcome back to the penultimate session. My name is Charles Waldheim. I'm the John Irving Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture here at the Harvard GSD, and it's my real pleasure to serve as MC for this session, dealing with the putative publicness in public space and relationships between public space and the public sphere. Our format will be a little bit distinct. We'll begin with two brief positioning papers, the first by George Baird on the subtle nuances of publicness, and the second by Gerald Caden on occupying public space. And then we'll transition to a panel format during which Alex Krieger, Gary Hildebrand, and Elizabeth Cohen will present the case of Boston City Hall and its adjunct plaza for then a discussion with both our paper presenters and our panelists. I'll introduce the panelists when we go into that format. Our second paper will be by our own Gerald Caden. Caden is the Frank Bacchus Williams Professor of Urban Planning here at the GSD. His work, as many of you know, deals with the relationship between law and the built environment and urbanization, particularly public-private relationships in urban development. He is, among other things, author of Zoning and the American Dream, as well as the previously published and now back in the news cycle, privately owned public space, the New York City Experience, some of which I think that material he'll be referencing in his conversation about the Occupy experience and the occupation of public space. Our first paper is by George Baird. George is Emeritus Professor and Dean of the John Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. He was previously the G. Ware Travelstead Professor of Architecture here at the GSD for a decade from '93 till 2004. He is, among other things, author of The Space of Appearance and the more recent public space critical political theory, street photography. He also is, as of about 9:30 this morning, the Topaz Medal laureate for 2012. George Baird.
Thank you, Charles. I have a little preface to make. There are two kinds of conferences formats for which I like. One is when you have a very small group of participants, like maybe not even more than two, who are well known to have distinctly opposing positions, and they go at it in front of you. More or less, you could call it a debate. At the other extreme, you have a larger group of people who are famous for holding relatively close positions one to the next, and which means then that the whole focus of the discussion shifts to the nuances that partly link and partly separate them. And I actually myself, I really like those kinds of conferences. The conferences I don't like are the ones in between, where you have, too many people and they sort of have something to do with one another, but not entirely, and at the end of the conference you sometimes think, I'm more confused now than I was when I came in. Well, hats off to Mohsen Mostafavi. This conference is almost a consummate example of the second kind, where the nuances are the whole story. And indeed, the title of my talk, On the Subtle Nuances of Publicness, I had this kind of strange feeling as I was listening to the fascinating presentations yesterday and this morning that my title could have been used by most of them. And this has had a disconcerting kind of implication for me because I'm relatively late on in the program, and so there were more than a few moments when I thought, my God, when I finally get up there, will there be anything left that hasn't already been said? Well, I'll just leave that question hanging there with you while you hear my presentation, since I don't think I'm going to shock people that have already spoken ahead of me with what I have to say. Only perhaps in two respects. One is I've deliberately made this thing somewhat aggressively theoretical, so the sociological denizens of data may think I've gone too far. Maybe I have. And secondly, I think I'm actually going to be quite shorter even than the 20 minutes. And I'm hoping that that will turn out to be true, because I'm actually tempted to add a kind of footnote to this, which is a little commentary on the first panel this morning, which I found extremely provocative, but we'll see whether I have time to come back to that. My timekeeper is very close to me, and she's already threatened me. I want to begin my presentation by thanking Mohsen Mostafavi for asking me to join the participants in this interesting symposium. When I wrote that, I didn't know how interesting it was going to be. Indeed, an early presentation of the material of a book I have just published on public space was made some years ago at Mohsen's invitation during his tenure as chair of the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. Interestingly enough, again, I will be returning to the JSD in about 4 weeks to make an extended presentation of part of that book. So for me, in a sense then, this presentation closes a kind of interesting loop between the two of us. I have been troubled for some time by a tendency in discussions about public space in architectural circles for a problematic polarization to set in. On the one hand, a tendency exists to resurrect obsolete historical models of publicness. I associate some of the more retrograde versions of the new urbanism, for example, with that tendency. Then, on the other hand, we also see a tendency for a belief in the possibilities of publicness to vanish altogether. I could cite here, for example, Aaron Betsky's rather cynical polemic of a few years ago, "Nothing but flowers against public space." In both of these cases, it seems to me that the actual condition of being in public, to use a phenomenological term, is schematized almost to the point of extinction. That is to say, according to such arguments, if public life cannot be formal, or cannot be heroic or grandiloquent, then it cannot exist at all. This, in my view, is a very serious misunderstanding. Excuse me. And it is in aid of its refutation that I want to focus here on what I have called the subtle nuances of publicness, in which, in my view, the public life of each and every one of us begins. As I see it, publicness begins in the realities of everyday life. We can see such realities in ample play in this remarkable image of a street scene in Wuhan, China, photographed by Thomas Struth. Being in public includes such modest phenomena as street conversation, as shown here in an image by John Sarkovsky. Somewhere, in my view, at the center of being in public is sheer sociability, captured here in a photograph by the Korean-American photographer Nikki Lee. But publicness can also be erotic, as illustrated here by Henri Cartier-Bresson, or performative, as shown here in one by Bill Brandt. Only in the unusual, not to say extraordinary, circumstance does being in public become heroic, as shown here in the news photograph of a courageous young man putting his life on the line in Tiananmen Square. In the first instance, then, our participation in the public is barely intentional at all. Indeed, I would argue that it is almost distracted, to use the famous phrase of Walter Benjamin. And it is in our gradual coming to a conscious awareness of our relations with others out in the world that our public lives take on the very real possibility to become political. Now, it is probably appropriate for me at this point to express another reservation in regard to the new urbanism in this matter, and that is its tendency to flirt with communitarianism. One of our moderators this morning referred to the somewhat worn-out term of community. By now, I think it is fair to say that the concept of community has become a somewhat cloying characterization of our modes of living together in the world, and the communitarian version of this, with its emphasis on familiarity and togetherness, runs the risk of prejudicing the condition of pluralism that is an essential commitment of public life today. It remains of the utmost importance that the city, in a phrase that Richard Sennett spoke in the first book of his I ever read many, many years ago, In the Fall of Public Man, that a city may be defined as a place where strangers are likely to meet. Accordingly, the high priority placed by communitarians on familiarity and togetherness tends to compromise urban diversity. By the same token, I would insist that another essential condition of publicness in our time is an operative, perhaps even subconscious code of courtesy. This also came up in some of the presentations this morning in a way that I thought was quite fascinating. A perhaps unconscious code, subconscious code of courtesy, consideration, and readiness to assist others in difficulty, even among groups of urbanites who are strangers to one another. The importance of this issue and the gravity of its being put in question was graphically portrayed in the recent news episode in China when a small child was injured by a vehicle in the street and passers-by did not immediately rush to the child's aid. I have also in recent times begun to speculate that there may even be varying degrees of publicness operative in the city. I am, for example, inclined to think of the absolutely ordinary street as the most intensely public place available to us all, even more public than a square, and even more again than a park. And the reason for this is that of all of these extant types of public space in the city, the street requires of us the least degree of intentionality in our actually being there. The street is less likely to be a conscious destination than the square or the park, and it possesses, therefore, the greatest potential for serendipitous occurrences. At the same time, I want to dissociate myself somewhat from critics, not sure whether or not I'm picking a fight with Gerald here or not, of critics of such semi-public venues as shopping malls. It is indisputably true that such places, being privately owned, are not available for the same degree and variety of public activities as a street. But I would argue that this only qualifies rather than invalidates their publicness. And in this regard, I would remind you that Jürgen Habermas, in his seminal text, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, saw the new clubs and coffee houses of 18th century London as key origins of that sphere, as he called it, and they, of course, also were not fully public venues. I want to conclude this short commentary with a comment on the invidious and ever more pervasive contemporary phenomenon of the gated community. Such places are usually criticized for their exclusion of outsiders, and we've already heard some of that this morning. And there is no doubt that this exclusion is a grave concern. But we can also say that at the same time that they exclude, such communities also degrade the condition of being in public for their inhabitants. Imagine, for example, being a teenager growing into adulthood in such a place. One would be problematically constrained in one's capacity to learn what the world is like and what one's own place in it might be. No wonder such teenagers are attracted by the suburban shopping mall, the venue where their expanding desire to see and to be seen among their peers is most readily, most locally available to them. In fact, thinking about those teenagers puts me in mind of Elizabeth Wilson's feminist tract of some years back, The Sphinx in the City. As the somewhat obstreperous Wilson put it, why are the adventures available in the city appropriately available only to men? Why should not women also participate in the manifold adventures of the urban? And to conclude, I would simply ask, why indeed? So, now how am I doing?
8 minutes.
Okay, that'll be enough. I was really I have been an admirer of Krzysztof Wodiczko for a long time, and I was quite intrigued by his presentation this morning. Not that I wasn't also by that of Michael Arad, whom I'd never seen explained before, and I found myself thinking, my goodness, aren't they lucky that they had a designer of such magnanimous composure and serene equipoise to kind of deal with so charged a design problem as the design of the 9/11 memorial. I thought it was an astonishingly gracious modus operandi he showed us, and I can just imagine the relief of Mayor Bloomberg that they had someone of such diplomatic skills available to them. Something. But in any event, to return to Wodiczko and his interesting proposition for the Arc de Triomphe, it put me in mind of a project I suspect not very many of you will be familiar with, and had I known what Wodiczko was going to show, I could easily have included it in my own presentation. For the 1976 Olympics in the city of Montreal, an architect colleague of mine called Melvin Charney, who operates part of the time in the world of architecture and another part of the time in the world of art, a rather Wodiczko-like world of art, in fact, was invited to do, for many years now, the Olympics have always had these parallel cultural programs. Well, as part of the parallel cultural program for the 1976 Olympics, Charney was invited to install a cultural installation along Sherbrooke Street in Montreal. And he did it, and it extended almost all the way from Westmount to the Olympic site on the eastern side of the downtown. And Melvin had in those years been very preoccupied by the history of the city of Montreal, the destruction of its working class neighborhoods, the emergent controversies about historical preservation of buildings in the city. And Corridart, as this project was called, became a kind of summa of his kind of representation of those issues in the city. He did a whole series of scaffoldings, not unlike the one Wodiczko showed for the Arc de Triomphe, at strategic points along the street, mounted large panels, photographs of historical events at those particular places in the city, photographs of historical buildings that had been destroyed, lots of kind of neighborhood memorabilia from place to place along the street. Some actual partial reconstructions of the facades of buildings had been destroyed. All of this going block after block after block through the center of the city. Well, the night before the opening of the Olympics, the then mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau, a famous and rather autocratic character, had the entire installation destroyed and removed overnight, the morning, just preceding the morning of the opening of the Olympics. And in fact, Charney, it's arguable that Charney, who's now quite elderly and in poor health, it's arguable that he was kind of marked by life, by the kind of trauma of this. In a certain kind of political way, one could say he asked for it, but it was such an extraordinary manifestation of provoked state power. Krzysztof Wodiczko knows this perfectly well, though he was too cagey to admit it this morning. But us architects have a harder job being political than the artists do, because they get these kind of higher First Amendment privileges of being in the art gallery, where Hans Haacke couldn't do what Hans Haacke does if he was doing it out in the street. And Melvin discovered he couldn't do what he was doing out in the street. Though I thought Wodiczko's handling of the questions of the feasibility of his project, the analogy with the Centre Pompidou, was very deft, somehow I doubt that project is going to sort of come to fruition as an actual built thing in the world. The Charney episode rather kind of reminds me of that fragility of its possibilities. So it does seem to me, I don't know how much consequence this will have for the presentation about the Boston City Hall Plaza, But it is interesting to me to see, and it's another of the subtle nuances of public that was not in my prepared remarks, the extent to which the kind of operative degree of maneuvering room which is available to us as designers out in the world, in the public world, has these kind of remarkably graduated kind of possibilities inherent in it, and it's a very, very interesting socio-political question to figure out exactly where they lie. Two slightly surrealist anecdotes, and I will sit down. The first one is finding that line. An early installation of Diller and Scofidio on 42nd Street in New York, after it was bought, but before it was all, the previously raunchy 42nd Street was all wiped out. Diller and Scofidio did an installation on the doors of one of the former porn theaters, which was a giant pair of red lips, out of which a voice sort of accosted you on the street sidewalk. Hey, you, wanna buy a video cassette recorder? And the other one has to do with a meeting of the Socialist International somewhere in Europe, I've forgotten where. This is an anecdote described in Peter Nettle's biography of Rosa Luxemburg. There's a discussion going on about a policy proposal which has been put forward by Luxemburg, and one of the French delegates to the meeting makes a kind of impassioned attack on this proposal, arguing deeply and emotionally and angrily against it, en français, of course. Then, since there are a lot of German speakers who don't speak French in the meeting, and this, of course, precedes the days of simultaneous translation, there's a question of someone in the room needing to translate this statement so that the non-French speaking Germans in the meeting can understand the import of the French objection. Well, there's a kind of awkward moment finding somebody who's willing to take on this slightly delicate political task until the eminently bilingual Luxemburg herself stands up and takes on the task of translating for the Germans the substance of the attack of her French colleague against her proposal. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, please.
On the side, there's some space in the front, so if you guys want to actually see what Gerald is going to present, just come in.
Okay, great. That's great. But and to turn this on, you'll put it on when I say to put it on, right?
Actually, yeah, I don't know if their heads are going to block it on.
Well, that's a good question, isn't it?
Well, we'll see. Probably the bottom of it.
Take it down. All right, take it down, since I didn't want it out.
Okay. Just let me know.
Okay, great. All set? Okay, great. In future years, people will remember 2011 as the year in which physical public space reclaimed a weighty status in the public sphere thanks to audacious actions taken by engaged individuals. From Tahrir Square to Zuccotti Park, physical public space convincingly asserted the centrality of conventional physicality in accommodating and nurturing political protest and debate. Now, there are many ways of thinking about Occupy Wall Street and progeny worldwide. What I'd like to address this afternoon in my talk is the importance of physical public space for the Occupy movement and related efforts, the legal and policy framework within American society that has been used to construct the use of public space and our conception of it, and finally how that construction actually affects multiple users and uses. Now, as we've heard already, physical public space comes in many flavors. There are indeed publicly owned streets and sidewalks and squares and parks. There are privately owned public space that actually legally must be open and usable by the public. There are public libraries and community centers and city halls. And there are even indeed privately owned shopping malls, although in fact they're normally not legally required to be open and usable by the public at large. The spaces I want to address this afternoon share one particular characteristic, and that's that there is a legal obligation attached to them to be open to the public for some sort of public use. Now, that legal obligation to be open to the public for some sort of public use springs from a variety of sources. One source may be the identity of the owner of the space, which can create some sort of obligation for public access. Another source springs from government regulations that can create actually a contractual relationship between the owner of the space, normally a private owner, and government that also guarantees public access. But the ambiguity inherent in the phrase that I used, open to the public for some sort of public use, truly says it all. What publics? What public uses? And finally, who decides? Each public will have its own answer to that question. And each public will assert its own legal frame for answering that question. And what makes this an especially interesting time and moment for public space now is that much of it, and in the United States, many would say far too much of it, is created and managed by public-private partnerships. And that is not strictly a United States phenomenon. It's now becoming more of a worldwide phenomenon. In the U.S. particularly, although this is true elsewhere, we have moved from public ownership and public management of public space to public ownership and private management of public space, now to private ownership and private management of public space. We all know about privately owned public spaces that have been particularly in the news recently, not just a New York City phenomenon, but one that scans the continent in San Francisco and Seattle, that spans the world in Hong Kong and New Zealand. You can find them in many, many different places. There also are friends of groups and conservancies to provide money and management. And these sorts of privatizations introduce a special set of tensions governing public space. Political protest in public space serves as a particularly illuminating kind of public use to explore some of these tensions and ideas regarding ownership, control, and management of public space. And a perfect case study, of course, and very much in the news, has been Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park. Now, there are many actors in this drama. Of course, the members of Occupy Wall Street, the privately owned public space owner Brookfield Office Properties, various agencies and officials and staff members and employees of government, neighbors, citywide residents, other groups spread around the city and indeed the country and the world. It's worth reminding ourselves, as many people now understand, although they didn't at first, that Zuccotti Park is not a city-owned park. It's a privately owned public space, what I've often referred to as law's oxymoronic invention, privately owned public space. The space is indeed privately owned, but by law, not by voluntary goodwill, but by law, must be open and usable by the public. It's one space, around 3/4 of an acre in size, in a veritable archipelago of plazas, arcades, and other outdoor and indoor spaces scattered principally about Manhattan. There are over 530 of these plazas, arcades, and indoor and outdoor spaces, representing in total over 3 million square feet. That's about 10% of Central Park, if you aggregated it all together. And in return for the provision of this over 3 million square feet of public space, owners, developers of private office and residential towers were granted the ability to construct, and they did, over 20 million square feet of rentable and sellable space. That's a lot of space and a lot of money that's embedded in these buildings to this day. That's through incentive zoning. So let's at least ground ourselves in Zuccotti Park. Let's take a look at it. Before we do, how many people actually visited Zuccotti Park with the Occupy Wall Street occupation? Okay, so it's really not a large number of the group, so that's even better. Let's do the slides. That wasn't my question, Alex. But I'm glad to know that as well, and we'll look at some of them. Okay, so this is indeed Zuccotti Park. Obviously, not with Occupy Wall Street there. Zuccotti Park is a privately owned public space. It's a plaza. It has trees, a sitting area, and lighting, and it's required by law to be, quote, accessible to the public at all times. It's also described in legal documents as what amounts to a permanent open park in the heart of one of the most densely built-up areas in the world. In 2005, this particular space was improved with permission of the City of New York, with 55 honey locust trees, an extra 1,000 linear feet of fixed seating, 16 fixed tables with fixed seats, an abstract steel sculpture, and some new lighting. And indeed, owner Brookfield Properties at the time changed the name of the space from Liberty Park to Zuccotti Park. And to this day, I'm not sure how John Zuccotti really feels about his notoriety or fame, depending on how you want to call it. Now, here are the rules that governed Zuccotti Park at the time of the occupation. You can see it's open to the public, Zuccotti Park, and these are the only rules that governed it. No skateboarding, rollerblading, or bicycling allowed in the park, which of course is an invitation for Occupy Wall Street. And indeed, tactically or serendipitously, Occupy Wall Street chose the perfect space to occupy 24/7. And that's because, ironically, Occupy Wall Street enjoyed greater rights in this privately owned public space than it would in a publicly owned space. Indeed, city-owned parks close every night, whereas this privately owned public space must be open day and night. City-owned parks have a variety of expressly posted rules, while the rules expressly posted at the time of the occupation are before you. So let's see what happened. Here is indeed, and I'll just go through these slides of Occupy Wall Street. And it was a community. It had a space for the press, as you can see there. Protests throughout. There's the name here, One Liberty Plaza, of what it used to be called. These don't need narration. See, they're into isms as well. Now, it was a very well-organized kind of operation. And indeed, these are two of the members of Occupy Wall Street providing information, although deeply suspicious of me in terms of why I'm asking questions. They had their news operation. And indeed, you can see when I was there, Steve Jobs had just died with the weather, etc. They had their own newspaper, since they were several blocks from Wall Street. And they had indeed their media center and computer center. Outreach again, public relations for this, I don't want to use the word community. Private and municipal unions can gather here. That's because of you, George. A library. What you're going to see is, this is a city serving food to all comers, and with hygiene. Storage area for sleeping, and indeed that was one of the major activities in the space. Art throughout the space. and you could fill in on his board. Music, which didn't make the neighbors very happy. Performance art. This is sort of performance art with Keith Olbermann's head in the background. It's actually his head. He appears everywhere. Again, media just recording this absolutely ever. This is a presidential candidate speaking that no one has ever heard of. And then every other kind of activity that you'd find. I was struck by Michael's presentation this morning in which he said he wanted to have both memory celebrated or commemorated in this space, but also a party or happiness or pleasure or normal activities that you'd find in a public space. And indeed, this space had it all. Playing chess, yoga, tantric yoga, by the way. Just a lot of people just doing normal public space activities. Except, of course, this was anything but a normal public space. And ringing the space is another collection of individuals, which is the security people of the city of New York, the police. And indeed, they had a sort of funny relationship, at least when I visited, to the protesters or the members of Occupy Wall Street. Not quite sure what to do with them, but friendly, talking. What was interesting, again, is this on the sidewalk, individuals had less rights than in Zuccotti Park. Move along, you're not allowed to loiter, you can't. But if you go into the space, you can do whatever you want to do. Publicly owned sidewalk, privately owned public space. And as I said, city-owned parks. Here's City Hall Park, immediately to the south of City Hall, 2 blocks away. At the exact time, I just walked down there after I just took those photographs, and this is what you have there. You know, there's no Occupy Wall Street or Occupy anything. You just have sort of a very sort of quiet space. You can see, by the way, they've put in, you know, some special gating material to make sure that the sort of thing that happened 2 blocks away didn't happen here. And these are the rules. You know, and you can read them. It's welcome to City Hall Park. All sorts of things you cannot do there. You have to get a permit to protest. You can't rally without a permit. You can't stay overnight. You can't bring in sleeping material. All sorts of complicated rules compared to this. Now, let's compare this to this. Here are the post-Occupy Wall Street rules that Brookfield Office Properties invented, which is fine. And many people have said they can't do new rules. No, that's not true. They can do new rules if they, in fact, want to. And indeed, they did. And you can see now the new rules prohibited the following while Occupy Wall Street was in residence: camping and or the erection of tents, lying down on the ground, sleeping, lying on benches, placement of tarps, storage of personal things, all of the sorts of things that was in fact occurring on the space, rendering the space strictly a space now for passive recreation, which is, of course, what they had in mind. And based on these new rules, which were imposed, and again, you can impose new rules, Occupy Wall Street, you know, was asked to leave, which they didn't. And Brookfield Office Properties went to the city and said, there are all these people trespassing on my privately owned public space in violation of my rules. Please remove them. And indeed, the people were, as we know, removed. Now, immediately after that, they went to a judge to seek, in this case, his guidance on what should happen. They wanted to go back into the space and have a judicial ruling that would allow them to continue to occupy. This is Brookfield's letter, by the way, to the police commissioner asking him to remove people from the space. They went to the judge, and the judge ruled with 2 judgments. First, that the rules imposed by Brookfield were reasonable under the zoning resolution, and that even if Brookfield Office Properties were viewed as a state owner, a government owner, this would be reasonable, because under the First Amendment, dealing with free speech and freedom of assembly, government still has the right to say, we impose time, place, and manner restrictions, which deal with when somebody can use a space and how they can use it and in what manner. And you can imagine that for any major roadway. Imagine if I want to protest in the middle of Fifth Avenue with a placard and just stay there and block traffic. Well, you can't do that all the time, and in fact you could probably be restricted virtually all the time from doing it. In other words, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions apply even against the government. So here we are back at Zuccotti Park as it is more or less today, without Occupy Wall Street. Now, one thing I want to mention is what happened after this. I started to get a lot of telephone calls from members of Occupy Wall Street when this occurred, and they were very interested in this book I had written called Privately Owned Public Space, because they viewed it as a potential guide to basically another 500 places that they could go if they couldn't go to Occupy Zuccotti Park. I had anticipated this when I wrote the book, hoping that I would have sales in the political protest camp. And indeed, there they were. So I'd like to show you what happened. I got a call from them immediately prior to this attempt at an occupation. I'd like to show you a video, 1 minute, of what happened with a very nearby privately owned public space at 100 William Street.
Read the sign. One more warning. You do not enforce the law.
Public space.
This is in the beginning. Jump back to the beginning of the video.
Let's go, stop moving. Business days, let's go, stop moving. You can tell that to the judge after we arrest you. I'm telling you, I don't want you here. It's private property, time to leave, okay? So, it says, you can stay there, you'll arrest you, you can tell it to the judge in the morning, okay? I know, thank you very much for your cooperation. Stop moving.
So you can easily look it up. It's on the NYC. Can I show you on the website?
Okay. So this goes on for another 5 minutes. They don't get in the space, tell it to the judge. And that leads to my 4 observations that I'd like to make and then close down. With regard to the Occupy movement, political protest, and public space. First, the physical occupation of the space itself is a core element of the speech. The space is not just accommodating people who speak out on any topic of interest. The occupation of the space itself, without more, is the political speech, especially a space owned by a private owner associated with capitalism. Especially, by the way, an occupation organized to demonstrate in physical terms that people can get together in a community structure, as we saw, and be happy. So the space is not a means to an end. The occupation itself is indeed the speech. Second, transgressive occupation is a core element of the speech. Disobeying the law, causing inconvenience to others, and that has very important implications for designing public space. Because in my view, public space designed for transgressive occupation is a non-starter. In short, Speaker's Corner will only go so far, even as undesigned as it is at the edge of Hyde Park. We can, of course, worry about public space actually designed against public use. And more generally, we should worry about public space designed against the poor and the powerless, the homeless. And indeed, spikes on benches and ledges carry a political as well as a physical edge by telling who can and cannot use the space. Public spaces actually become spaces of exclusion and discrimination. Third, should public rules demand spatial pluralism? Occupy Wall Street actually took over a public space, but what about the rights of other publics? A marketplace of ideas. Do we really want to formalize a permitting process? But one can ask, does every public space and every square foot of public space have to always serve all publics? Or can we say this serves that public and that serves another public? And finally, fourth and in conclusion, who should write the rules for design and for stewardship? And don't think they aren't written. There needs to be a very public conversation, and I would suggest a very inclusive one, about who drafts these rules. Now, some would argue that failure is cooked into the DNA of the public-private ownership or management model. To be sure there are tensions, I suggest that that model is indeed here to stay as a subset of public space. But I remind us that the identity of the owner, in short, doesn't solve the problem. Public owners exercise rights of ownership with control and exclusion, often as virulently as private owners. So we need to confront these tensions openly and directly, and I look forward to hearing more conversation about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gerald and George. If you would care to join us, if our panelists could join us. Joining George Baird and Gerald Caden, we have three panelists, two of whom will be presenting some baseline material on the specifics of the case of Boston City Hall and its plaza. Elizabeth Cohen is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and Interim Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Her research focuses on the history of the urban built environment in the 20th century as a subset within U.S. history. She's previously author of A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America. She's presently working on a book-length project, Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue, and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, something that I think that she'll say a couple of words about here. Gary Hildebrand is principal of Reed Hildebrand Associates and adjunct professor of landscape architecture here at the Harvard GSD. He is, among other things, presently working as a consultant as a part of a team for the reconsideration of Boston's City Hall Plaza. Alex Krieger is professor in practice of urban design and planning at the Harvard GSD and also principal of the architecture and urban design firm Chan Krieger. He is most recently co-editor of the 2009 volume Urban Design. So Alex is going to begin with a few kind of baseline comments, presentation of a few images about Boston City Hall and its plaza, and then Gary will follow, and then Liz will have a few words to say about the history of the project.
Thanks, Charles. I thought that my role was to introduce you to or reintroduce you to a very public space not often used by the public. And that's been one of the criticisms labeled against it. It dates back to '62 as a result of an international competition. These two young men in the picture, at least they were young then, Gerhard Kohlmann and Michael McKinnell, won the competition to produce, the competition to produce the space, the building and the space. Of course, what's less well known, because they get lots of blame for the space, is that the space was a result that the decision to make a large space was not theirs. That was part of a master plan that preceded this, actually designed by Harry Cobb, our own Harry Cobb, as Pay Cobb Free. So this was their interpretation of what this large public space should do in relationship to City Hall. It's important to understand this in relationship to moment in history. That's one of Liz Cohn's favorite people there, at least of late, Ed Logue, the administrator of the BRA, also the chief administrator of all the urban renewal projects in Boston. You can see the city virtually covered by them. One of the most famous or infamous ones, depending upon your point of view, was the Government Center Urban Renewal Plan, out of which City Hall and its plaza emerged. This actually is a very historic document. It's the takings plan issued by the BRA. You could call it redlining. It's even misspelled if you note at the bottom, the taking misspelled. And this determined this area to be slummed and therefore subject to a public taking and therefore converted to a public use, or at least improved by the public and then allowed to be redeveloped either by public or private sector. This is one of these sort of harrowing photographs we tend to forget. This was sort of planned bombing, really. This was what it looked like around 1965 during the construction of the City Hall and its plaza as part of, you can see, a much wider area of Boston was demolished as part of the urban renewal projects there. This just kind of reminds you the kind of before and after condition. Scully Square was deemed to be slummed and obsolete, and therefore was replaced by a kind of a new symbol of the cradle of liberty, which Bostonians in modesty occasionally call themselves, the seat of the three branches of American government: state, city, federal, around a major public space that was to kind of designate, in a way, the re-arrival of Boston on the scene of progressive, worthy of investment cities on the heels of a long, several decades of disinvestment and kind of lack of regard, really. Right? This is a photograph done by a local photographer. They didn't have to actually demolish all of Scully Square in order to build City Hall. They might have left more of these buildings, but none of them were deemed to be essential. In fact, they were all deemed to be actually a deterrent to redevelopment and to create a much more engaging, important, progressive, forward-looking public space. Something like 16 streets, actually 19 streets, this may be a little confusing, 19 streets, 19 public streets were eliminated, replaced by 6 broader public streets to create this sort of larger superblock to accommodate these facilities. This I call a sort of a centerfold. It actually is a centerfold. It's the center of a special supplement to the New York Times, paid for by the city government, saying, look, all of you captains of industry, it's time to come back to Boston. We are preparing Boston for your re-arrival. We're demolishing, we're getting rid of the old, whoops, I meant to point as opposed to, we're getting rid of the old. We're going to show you what the new looks like, the City Hall as well. There's the master plan produced by Paycott Freed, and this tells you about how Boston is now ready to be once more engaged in and reinvested in. Very, very important for a point of history in Boston, which was not doing very well for the prior 30 or 40 years, not doing very well at all. The kind of the Detroit, if you will, almost, of the 1950s. The architects themselves often, they now tend to say not, but often said that they were trying to achieve for Boston what the Campo and Siena achieved for Siena. They got the amount of brick right, that's for sure, right? They certainly did that, right? But they're quite serious about this, and there you have, of course, a semi-annual event that takes place in the Campo and Siena. There you have a not quite as frequent event, but nonetheless, occasionally, more often recently, given the prowess of our athletic teams, a major assembly. And in fact, not quite fair to say that the plaza is never used. It is actually used fairly frequently, if you think about decades rather than days, for such events.
When our teams win.
Yeah. Well, there have been political demonstrations as well. But of course, the problem with it is that most of the time it kind of looks like this, and it looks even worse if you think about it, and you assume that it's not a place actually for human habitation most of the time. The mayor, in recent times, of course, wants to demolish the building, which he hates fiercely, for some good reasons, not for architectural reasons, but for some good reasons. It's not been well maintained at all, ever, really, partially because people don't like it. And the plaza has been less of a concern, except there's a long history of trying to improve it because it seems easier to do, in theory, as opposed to tackle the building. So again, a little compilation of different kinds of events that do take place periodically. And for example, when the new public bicycle program was initiated, where did it begin? Appropriately, of course, the first bicycles moved out of City Hall Plaza. It has had a long history of replanning. I carry a bit of a scar from 7 years of trying it. This was, in a sense, to summarize, a way to try to establish an inner lining, to kind of paint an active inner lining, to make it a bit more like the Campo and Siena, which does not depend on the use of the center for its daily activities. It didn't get very far. A very modest result was a structure that accommodates at least a seasonal event, which is a market. 10 years later, finally, we hope, Gary and I hope, a subway stop that looks like this bunker right there is about to be replaced by a more modern subway stop. Now, I actually want to sort of turn over to Gary with this image. This is the first image I ever took of the plaza in 1975 when I first arrived at Cambridge. And look at it. it's actually very well used. This is not a Sunday. This is not an athletic event. This is a weekday afternoon. Notice the fountain, which has not been operating for many years there. Notice actually the bunch of vendors that occupy the perimeter of it. And so I sort of will end my little provocation by saying that to some extent, contemporary society produces maybe too much rather than not enough public space. What happened? Where did all those people go? They went down to Faneuil Hall Marketplace as soon as that opened. And to some extent, this very public place was made obsolete by another public place, semi-public, however Gerald wanted to describe it, which has taken over the role in many ways of what this was intended to serve when it was originally conceived by its architects and planners.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it looks like we have a font issue and a counting issue. I'm going to talk about three things. They're all number one. We'll let that take care of itself. Don't use Scala. That's the. People know me around here as a tree guy, kind of, but I'm thinking a lot about brick these days. I should mention that our commission, which is not really underway yet, is one in which Alex and his firm and I and my firm, Reed Hildebrand, and Tim Love and his firm, UTIL, are joined with a couple of engineering firms to have yet another look. Imagine another look at rebuilding City Hall. This slide tells me something about stewardship. And the mayor's potential redemptive move, which is the possibility of remaking something of City Hall Plaza, has to do with a long period of very poor stewardship, both for the building and for the site. And I was pleased that Gerald mentioned this issue of stewardship, and in the school we talk about it in the context of critical conservation. It is an issue which I think has been at the root of a great disservice to the people of the city of Boston and to the mayor himself, who doesn't like the building because he and his predecessors have not taken care of it. And the condition of the plaza is also something that, frankly, this project that we are engaged in must be undertaken in some manner because the plaza is falling apart. The second issue is that of monumentality. When the government center plan was produced by Ian Pei, David Crane, Ed Logue, many greats, Kevin Lynch involved in some of that work, there was an idea of clearing the city, a disruption, complete disruption, in fact, of this entire place. And the idea of joining those branches of government together that Alex mentioned, but in one that I'll add, the federal government in the place of the John Fitzgerald Kennedy building, and the location of the Governmental Services Administration, and so on. The bankers, because they are never that far from such wholesale clearing of the city. In several of these projects, you can see one beacon going up there and Century Plaza. But I was talking about government. So you have the federal government, you have the state government, which is of course up here and also in offices throughout, and you have of course the city government, and you have the judiciary, which this plan, for all intents and purposes, was thinking about bringing together with these branches of government, and indeed walled it off. So that great square called Pemberton Square, which was in the front of the courthouse, is actually, in a sense, very hard to find. One has to go through a rabbit's warren to get to it, and so on. So there is a kind of paradox for me in the monumentality here, two kinds. One is that the structures themselves are large, they're monumental. It's a mid-century modernist ideal of monumentality. At the same time, that is walling off the condition of the traditional city adjacent to it. So you have very big gestures that turn into buildings. Just off camera is sorry if I can get to the pointer here, is the Boston Government Center garage, which is dreadfully one of the largest buildings anywhere nearby. So that paradox is interesting. The other one is that, the other half of that paradox is that, in fact, the surface of the city, taking away 16 or 17 streets, is conceived as a kind of continuous surface or a plane, mainly in brick. A lot of people have become allergic to that brick, and that's part of our problem. The other paradox is that in this moment, the idea of monumentality in government probably made some sense. Today, it doesn't. We don't go to the city hall. When I moved to Boston, I told Diane this morning, I went to the city hall to either pay a parking ticket or argue out of one. You literally had to go to a teller in the building. Today, I do that online, and we don't have the same kind of procession, let's say, to the seat of government, and let's say to the Venn diagram of our federal, state, and local government. So that to me is another paradox. Yet, and what I would love to have us have some conversation about is that the monumentality now that is embodied in the government center and in City Hall itself, and I would argue City Hall Plaza, is part of our cultural heritage. It's not a governmental operation kind of now. It is a part of a cultural heritage, which I think I'm here to defend in a way. As much as people dislike the vastness of the City Hall Plaza, we are going to find a way to resize it or reshape it. But we're not going to lose that sense of monumentality that was encoded beautifully, I think, in that plan. You can see it in this slide, in a sense. That the moving up of the floor of the city to, in a sense, kind of hold down this enormous monumental building, and that's really lovely. Another thing here is that it goes along with the question of what we do with that space. I would say this is not a contested space, but this photograph by Stan Forman, a famous Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph, some of you know Ted Landsmark, who the flag is being pointed at there, is a kind of indication that this is not so much a space of contention, but the space of witness, of contestedness, of contestation.
Anti-busing demonstration.
Right. So this was the place where that witness would occur. Today, it's more the place where the Big Apple Circus is, and so on. We've probably lost that, but you know, Gerald's talk is a reminder. I think in this past year, we can have the possibility that this space could again be the place where you witness that kind of social operation. We hope so. Lastly, I would like to talk about the performance of the surface here. I don't think that Coleman, McKinnell, and Knowles had to worry so much about what I'm about to talk about. There are, in an annual cycle, 10 million gallons of water running across the surface of this plaza. 10 million gallons. All of it is going into two tubes. 10% of it into the Charles River, 90% of it under Dock Square and out into the harbor. One of the reasons we're working on this is that there is a lawsuit because of bad practice that the city of Boston has historically had with respect to how it manages its stormwater flows. There's an enormous opportunity here. There's an enormous opportunity in the wasted energy in the private buildings around here as well. But what I'm interested in, and by the way, on a day like today or yesterday, if we have a 1-inch rainfall, 240,000 gallons of water just going away. Water's a precious resource? It doesn't seem it. Can we make this surface perform the social functions, and can we make it a living biological function as well? We have what I would consider to be almost no ecological function on the plaza today. A photograph of a project that Alex and I built together 4 years ago. This is a project that has 26 trees, and George, I was pleased to hear you say that the street, the ordinary street, where's George?
Right here.
Oh yeah, that the ordinary street
see your slides, Gary.
is the most profound place of social exchange, and this is something that would be in between the definition of a plaza and a street, but it's only 12,000 square feet and some sidewalk. 26 trees, 300,000 cubic inches of living biological matter under a surface that you can pick up with your hands and get at if you need to. Today, that would not be, 4 years later, that would not be able to look that way because of a rights issue around accessibility, which is something we could talk about as well. But we think of a surface like this as one that's porous, that's permeable, and I think this relates to questions that we heard of this morning, not only of social and not only about social permeability, but also about environmental permeability. We would like to have a project in the City Hall Plaza where the heritage that we have now of say 50 years that is profoundly disliked in many corners could be, in a sense, could be reversed, could perform many things that it doesn't today, that could also then be kind of poetic and a highly vaunted place in the city. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I come at the end of these very interesting and provocative papers, and I feel like what I have to say will echo a lot of what you have heard. I took the assignment quite literally and embraced the title of the conference, thinking about spaces of the political, and thought it might be interesting to think about why City Hall Plaza isn't functioning as a democratic space in a political way, why it isn't a site for spontaneous political activity. Are there characteristics that one should look for in a space that is conducive to that? And are they there in City Hall? If they're not, why not? And what's missing? So I thought we could just think, because I knew you could bring up the images in your own mind quite quickly. We've been exposed over the last year through Arab Spring to spaces that have had the potential of being, of entertaining, of being the sites of spontaneous political democratic participation. You can all, I think, bring to mind Tahrir Square. And I would remind you that at the center was a very busy, large traffic circle, heavily trafficked area, transit line junction, multiple uses of the space, a mosque, commerce, transit, assembly, trade. So that's one image. Another one, if you remember, the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain, which was really like a traffic circle, a junction, a place, an intersection where a lot of people moved, very close to the financial district there. And we got a very good sense from Gerald of Zuccotti Park, even though it wasn't legally perhaps public space, it functioned as public space. If you were there, and there were quite a number of people who were, you were very struck by how closely tied it was to the commercial area around it, the business and commercial area. It was incredibly dense and tight, very different from the City Hall Plaza area. So that what I would just want to point out here is that these spaces of democratic politics were at these moments over the last year, were actually being reused. They were not places that were designed necessarily for that one purpose of civic activity. There were many things going on there, some intentional, some not, and because of the access and comfort that people had in those spaces, they were able to sort of capture it and use it to their own purposes. So now let's put the Boston City Hall in that context. You've heard a fair amount about this, so I'll just repeat a few points here. Its original conception was to create impressive civic space, to give the city grandeur and monumentality like a European capital. They were very aware of that, as well as obviously in the plaza, thinking of the Siena example. They also were very tied to the notion of using the power of government to improve the economic standing of Boston. That's something that we find is very different from the world today, to think the government had that kind of power. But these were liberals of the 1960s who believed deeply in the power of government. And they thought that if they brought together the power of the federal government, the state government, and the municipal government, they could transform what was, they thought, a very kind of a city in decline and a neighborhood that was very much, in trouble. And that they would, their strategy was to use the modernist superblock to undo this warren, this sort of rabbit warren of streets dating from the 17th and 18th centuries, and create a vast plaza that would bring together these different levels of government. Their goals were that very, very concretely that they would create jobs, and they did. They would go immediately from 6,000 jobs in that area to 12,000 and more. That by bringing those offices together, they would then create this spillover of people who were all working in that district in Boston, and then would patronize businesses, restaurants, down what now we call Downtown Crossing, a shadow of its old self, but the department stores and so forth, and these local businesses would very much thrive. The important point here, I think, is that they had a very top-down strategy of going about doing this. They felt that they could dictate through creating a space that they could give a singular public function to, a plaza. A public plaza, a civic space, that they could actually bring about this economic revival, that they could make the city important again, the capital of the New England region, a business center, that they could somehow use this investment to get, and they did succeed in this, to get private business, the banks and so forth, to put up towers nearby. But that was going to be that was the leverage of government funding. And I interviewed about a year and a half ago, I interviewed Michael McKinnell, and if I had more time, I would read you some of the excerpts from the interview, because he's very thoughtful about all this. And I obviously asked him how he looked back on the plaza, and he said that, that at the time, they were aware that it was vast. And now they look back on it and they say, it was probably much too big. But part of the problem was that their idea was to actually have more mixed uses to it, so that when his partner Gerhard Kallman, who's German, when he thought about what a city hall and a city hall plaza should have, he said we need a Ratskeller, and they very much thought in terms of having restaurants and food and spaces of socialization there, and socializing, but they were told absolutely not. That first of all, we have the commitment to the spillover to the commercial world of Boston, but also we want to protect the purity of public space. And so they had this notion, a kind of liberal notion of the public space as being somehow divorced from commercial. So if we now return to Tahrir Square, to Pearl Roundabout, to Zuccotti Square in some ways, the point I want to make here is that these are spaces of everyday life. Here I'm going to echo some of what George said about the street. They are sites of commerce where people feel they have a right to be, that they know how to be, they feel comfortable being. And I think that it's important, there's no denying that we're living in a capitalist society, and these are spaces that have become increasingly the public spaces of this world. So what I want to I think it's important here that we make a distinction between where I think we all have the tendency, even if we want to distance ourselves from the liberal project of the 1960s of a kind of top-down reform, we also tend to have, I think, a suspicion of the idea of taking commerce and kind of empowering people as consumers. We see that as perhaps part of a neoliberal project. But here I think it's important that we make a distinction between what neoliberalism actually is, and you did point out that I think is really about ownership. I would argue that I think we need to recognize that in the world we're living in today, consumption, sociability that is built around commercial sites is very much the way we are in public. And so I guess the argument I would make for you guys as you kind of revisit this site is that, you really think about how to bring mixed use to it, to in a sense, hold your nose and say that, this may need to be commercial in certain ways if it's going to be comfortable for people, if they're going to know how to sort of function and be in that space. And that the sort of pure liberal project of having a public space that is somehow divorced from the market may actually not be the way to go. I mean, we all know that Starbucks today has a kind of comfort for people. They know what to do when they're there. And this runs against the arguments I made in my own Consumers Republic, a number of years ago, where I was suspicious of the shopping mall as no replacement for real public space. But, a lot's happened since 2003 when I wrote that book. And I think that when we go back to revisit a space and think about what could make people feel that this space is inviting, that they know how to be in it, that they have a right to it, it may be that there has to be mixed use for sure. And then when you go one step further and say what kinds of uses, I think the mixture of public and commercial may actually be very necessary. And I think here that the problem with Boston City Hall, when we look back on it, was that a group of planners and architects decided what the public should consider to be public space. And they felt that they declared it as such, and they wanted to wall it off and protect it as that. And I think we've seen over the last 50 years that that was not necessarily the way to go.
Thanks. Sorry. Just give a second. So, thanks very much. We're nearly done. We have about a half an hour. Over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to try to do a couple of things. I've promised Alex a rebuttal to his own initial opening remarks. He was presenting the kind of baseline case for City Hall as a case. I think with only occasional lapses into editorial territory, but I'll turn to him in a moment. I think by now this is the third such event that we've hosted here at the GSD over the last couple of years. And it occurs to me now, just looking at everyone and the kind of the difficulties of seeing slides and laser pointing, that for the first couple of these, as our audience was growing, Stubbins was the perfect venue. It was kind of collegial and intimate, and we could be conversational. And I don't know how you guys feel. I'm just at the beginning of feeling that maybe we've stretched this venue to its limits. But it's really lovely to see someone, so many of you turning out. I want to return from the case study of Boston City Hall at some moment in the next couple of minutes to the questions of type and typology that have been raised more broadly. But I've promised Alex the first response.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. I'm tempted to bring back one of the slides, but I won't. Two things. Of course, I completely agree with you, Elizabeth, and this is why I ended my non-editorial remarks by saying, to some extent, the plaza was made obsolete by the opening of a very consumerist project just down the street. That's where the 12 million tourists, both local and international, are right now, and there's very little reason to walk back up the hill to City Hall Plaza. But let me give you, but please don't blame the architects, always. So let me give you a very specific example. By the way, Gerhardt and Michael, who I know very well, I wrote a book about them and this and that. I've been consumed by this thing for decades. They've had to spend largely their entire adult life defending this thing. So some of their support for Rockskellers and all that stuff is kind of a bit more recent than it was back in 1962, I would say. However, in the plan that I struggled with for 7 years, with substantial support of the movers and shakers in Boston, non-profits, the major bankers and so forth, it had a commercial liner all around. That's what it was. That's what all those red lines were. Who would you suppose stopped it? It was the public. especially the GSA building, the federal building. And the administrator of GSA, the regional one, said, wait a minute, you are not going to put something between us and this public space. It's going to make us less important. It's going to degrade us to be behind some shop. And in fact, it was the public that stopped this project from achieving just what you, and correct, or at least I agree with you, should have, which is life around its edges rather than symbols of government edifices.
Sobering. What are you going to do this time?
I'll leave it that to Gary.
I'm
done, right.
I also want to amplify Gary's. He made a very kind of quiet disclaimer at the front end about they haven't started. I think this was both to kind of let you know that he wasn't going to present the project, and he also was going to preempt your response to the project before it was designed.
May I just say one more? May I just say one more word?
How can I say no?
Well, no. This is, I think, the plan that the so-called Trust for City Plaza plan was sort of totalistic. That is, it was going to transform the place somehow all of a sudden. That, I think, is simply impossible these days, whether it's the public that opposes it or whoever supports it. I think that the tack that Gary, with sort of my help, is going to try to do it in a more incremental basis to kind of get at parts of it. So that over time, like in fact the Campo Encino, or like in fact St. Mark's Square, it took centuries for it to take the shape that it has today. And that might be, in the end, I think, a more intelligent way to proceed, as disheartening as it is for planners and designers to not be able to kind of transform the environment kind of with one fell swoop.
I mean, I'll say maybe more about this in a moment, but I'm a little surprised by the disjuncture between the two halves of what I thought would have been a discussion of publicness in public space and its political dimensions and an object of study. I mean, I do want to have both George and Gerald have an opportunity to speak to City Hall and its plaza as a case. But I guess from my perspective, I'm also a little surprised, at least until Gary's careful characterization just at the end, of the overwhelming evidence that we now have available to us of its putative failure. I mean, I recall in my, the little bit of reading I've done into the topic, that it both was a project of international significance in its reception for the architectural and popular press. I mean, it received Guide Michelin stars, as I recall. And I also, given the cyclic nature of these things, have a sense, an intuition, that aren't we just another 5 or 10 years away from its being exactly, precisely in fashion again, from architectural and from design culture perspectives? I mean, are we running the risk of intervening finally after so many decades so as to win the wrong war? I mean, I was hoping that George would keep vibrating and be so compelled as to intervene.
Well, Charles is good at provoking me. It's hard to disagree with more activities around the edge. And the cynical part of me thought that, depending on how American politics goes, we kind of, watch with amazement from my side of the border. Maybe you'll have a new opportunity this time round in that, if the GSA wouldn't let you put the liner shops in front of it, maybe it wouldn't be out of the question that the GSA would be privatized, and the private organization that took over would see the obvious merit of renting out the ground floor of the building as it is for retail.
Actually, it's not so unlikely.
Well,
for the lower portion
you bet.
Yes, right.
So, but I, by the way, I was pleased that Gerald and I didn't end up disagreeing very much at all, as far as I could tell. But both he and even let me confess myself, kind of, we were a little bit apologetic when we were kind of disparaging the public and, moderating our criticism of the power of the private sector. And so that kind of, the kind of undercurrent, which I think, is pervading this whole panel of the primacy of the public, is kind of crashing, in my head, is crashing up against Saskia Sasson's from last night and Loïc Wacquin's this morning of, menacingly cautionary kind of observations on state power. And I found myself thinking if the acute social theorists in the room are cautioning us against the hegemony of state power at the same time as us, urban design types are kind of, expressing regret about the public. I mean, it's kind of opening up a kind of weird kind of vacuum in my mind. Well, if we can't trust the state with the public, then where is the savior going to be? And does there need to be some discussion here about kind of intermediary civil society, or because certainly, just to be completely cranky for a moment, I mean, I don't object to lining the edges, but the more I think about it recently, I think people don't talk about Camillo Sitta very much anymore. But his argument that being too big was a really huge problem on its own terms. This is still true, So I supported the idea of the intermediary buildings, but then that's a bit like Christophe Fedichko, persuading the Parisians to let him put scaffolding around the Arc de Triomphe. I can see why your scheme didn't fly, because you're just, you're up against power in relation to the status quo. So anyway, that kind of little set of conundrums I found rather provocative, and it seems to be lurking under the surface of our discussion. Oh, and by the way, of course, can't we say historically, Paca Charles, that Ed Loeb was just wrong to kind of rampage in there on such a kind of vast scale in the first place? I don't have any problem saying that. It was just wrong to knock that much of Boston down all in one go. And it was wrong then, and it's still wrong now. and Rahul wouldn't do it in Mumbai.
It's inconceivable what the segue might be from that last sentence. So, Gerald.
Well, I'm not quite sure it's inconceivable. I was almost beginning to think that George had turned into a Lockean philosopher, in which, indeed, John Locke, as we know, argued, among others, for private property itself being the bulwark against the mass overtaking of the state. So as we have these discussions, maybe there is a third way or a fourth or a fifth. We can talk about all of the various institutions and the mass public at large, Occupy Wall Street itself being, and all of the Occupy movements introducing a new public. If we were to focus, though, on City Hall Plaza, and what I thought was actually the interesting comments of Liz, which I don't know whether we agree or disagree, because I can imagine two ways of thinking about, the private market for City Hall. One is that we believe that City Hall Plaza will be a better public space if it actually has commercial uses within it itself as part of the mixed uses. Now, by the way, that could just be we contract the space to a size that it then works as an exclusive public space, so it might not actually be just introducing commercial uses. We may simply say, let's shrink it to where it inevitably is purely public. So we're not really introducing the private market into a public space. The other conception of the use of the private is what has happened around the world. Public-private partnerships, as I said, to produce public space, not necessarily because people are against the public owner providing public space, but because the public owner, government, simply doesn't have the money to do it anymore, and there's not the public will to do it anymore. So this becomes a second-best alternative in many people's mind, but better than the third, which is to at least have public space, and yes, we will rely on private money with all of the dangers inherent in that, and hopefully watch against those dangers, legislate against those dangers, protest against those dangers, but at the end of the day, still rely on private money to provide what we're calling public space. And, we all know the dangers of privatization that are inherent in that, but we do, at the end of the day, have to make a decision about whether we're purists about relying on the public sector to provide public space, or we're willing to rely on other engines to provide it. And as I finally mentioned in my direct remarks, it has been my observation empirically that public ownership itself does not guarantee, better public use of a space. And I have seen public owners act far more privately than private owners. And that applies, in short, to ownership. And my little example of City Hall Park, 2 blocks away, was meant to illustrate that.
Well, Joe, your careful characterization of that contradictory, would that be fair condition in which, in fact, whether it was tactical or happenstance, the idea of Zuccotti Park being a more fertile venue because of its quasi-private status. I'm trying to square that with your most recent comment that, in fact, there are these dangers. I mean, when you're giving advice to designers, you're suggesting there's very little in the project of designing for future occupation. And, in fact, ultimately, on that end of the spectrum of the conversation, there seems to be a great disjuncture between the activities of urbanists, planners, designers, architects, and the project of the political occupation of public space. They seem at that point to disjoin, and yet your advice to us seems to be concerned about the other end of the spectrum. That is, the physical design that would preclude certain things in publicly owned public space. I'm curious. On the one hand, I mean, I think there seems to be unanimity on the panel. On the one hand, about the kind of diminishing threat of privatization. I was struck by that, really across the board. I mean, Liz, you mentioned characterizing your own book project of a few years ago, saying, well, in fact, and George, your comments with respect to, the anxieties around commerce having been overstated, and you each modulated it in a different way. But on that score, it seems like we have quite a lot of common ground. On the other hand, I still don't have a real clear takeaway or a clear sense of, does typology matter? I mean, George, you introduced a spectrum, a kind of a wavelength across which you posited the idea of the street as being more available for publicness than the square or the park. And in fact, you further characterized the ordinary street, if I recall, as the prime venue for a certain kind of publicness. Now, to be fair, I don't think you meant in your remarks to suggest the immediate political occupation of that space. You referred to a kind of distracted occupation of publicness often. And so, on the other hand, I was also thinking that in the events of the Arab Spring that several of you have mentioned, I was thinking, George, of you and your work when it was true that the Tahrir Square was, led itself to a different conclusion than the Bahrain traffic circle. And I found even in my own, thinking, well, is there a kind of typological residue in which a square is substantially different and more ably occupied than a traffic circle? And if I think of that in my own question about that, and Baird's comments about a street as opposed to a square and a park, for me, one of the questions, maybe for all of you, is does the typology of that space ultimately matter vis its publicness, and as a subset of its publicness, its ability to be occupied for political speech?
Can I take that first? I mean, for me, the reason the ordinary street, is the beginning of it is because of this question of intentionality. We don't have to have a big plan in mind to go into the street. We're just going to work, or we're going to visit a friend, or we need a coffee. But we could meet somebody there, somebody we know, or we could bump into somebody that we just think looks interesting. So that's why I think I am interested in the spectrum, and that there can be a kind of ladder of progressively incremental intentionality that gets you to Tahrir Square or Tiananmen Square, but only at the very top end and only in extraordinary circumstances, and to kind of be expecting that you're certainly not going to design a space for that. But I do think there are some typological implications. I mean, if we go to Siena, for example, I mean, it's really interesting to me that, first of all, it's not as big as you might think. Well, as you pointed out with your scale comparisons with Boston. The edge of it is very tight and enclosed, and the kind of openings into it from the rest of the city are, the eye barely sees them when you're in the square. You kind of find your way into them. Then, when the palio actually happens, the focus of activity is actually around the perimeter, and the audience is in the middle. They don't actually rely on them. The middle of the square is not the focus of the event for which it is most famous. So there is a really interesting kind of sort of typological organizational scheme in play there which mixes together, some kind of conceptual inversions, kind of certain, degrees of sit-desk kind of enclosure, kind of, some optical considerations. All of those things come into play together in a way that makes it very powerful. Just to finish on Tahrir Square, when you do get a high enough degree of intentionality on the part of a large enough group of worked up people, then the physical characteristics of the space fall away in significance. And if it's in the middle of a traffic circle, so be it. If there's 1,000 of them, they can make it work for them.
And so could we take from that then, in that hierarchy, the volume of masses worked up sufficiently? But below that, in that hierarchy, if I understand it, would be the historical accumulation of significance, that the square was the square not because of its typology per se, but its historical occupation as such, more so than its design, and that ultimately, at the bottom of that spectrum, any space would be available irrespective of its type?
Well, you're polarizing it more than I would.
Fair enough. Gary?
I won't address it on a political basis, but I think the type of the plaza, the place, the place, is overlapped with the street. I mean,
oh, for sure.
You identified this, George, and I know it was absolutely strong in the belief system that produced this plan for the plaza, that picturesque part, cité, medieval city, you name it, is encoded in the drawings and in the early photographs, in fact, of the completion of the project. So on the issue of being incremental, I think there's a relationship here, because round numbers, if you were to rebuild City Hall Plaza, and without adding any architectural program, including that MBTA station, which will cost a lot of money, $30 million. Now, the government isn't going to have that money to spend, certainly not the city, right? So one way of thinking about this as a typological question is the reality that Cambridge Street and Congress Street participate in the way we understand City Hall Plaza. And we have two crummy streets there, but we have a possibility, and in our initial engagement, I think we've been successful in getting the city to at least work with the MBTA to exact what might be a better street on Cambridge Street as an edge. This isn't adding a liner of buildings at all. This is adding a boulevard, which would be a place of procession in which you would now have a little bit of right-sizing of City Hall Plaza because of the nature of that treed boulevarded street. Mm-hmm. And that could happen on Congress Street. The intention was that Dock Square and Faneuil Hall, the cradle of liberty, embodied in a building, was in fact a part of Government Center. And so Congress Street has a role to play. We now have a slightly different spatiality to City Hall Plaza, if you imagine those two streets rebuilt.
Alex?
Just three thoughts that may not be kind of coherent. But first of all, George, the cheap seats are in the middle in Siena. The expensive seats are all around the perimeter.
Oh, on the balcony.
And the balconies,
sure.
and on the grandstands, right. So the kind of the hoi polloi occupies, in fact, the center. The real public occupies the center. Just to kind of for clarification, I actually happened to be in the middle, almost crushed one summer, because I couldn't afford the bleachers, right. Secondly, there was one more motivation for a large hardscape, and that's kind of been forgotten. And that is the belief that the other public space, the other hallowed public space in Boston, the public garden and the common, was being trampled by public use. And that this was supposed to take some pressure off of the trampling of the lawns, especially the commons, so that it could maintain its sort of dignity, its kind of design and kind of more pastoral qualities. So I think that's important to say. And third, I would say, if we get off to Zuccotti Park for a second, that was not the only protest around, Gerald. If you went to see the one in Boston, it seemed to have been perfectly located. First of all, it had been located in the plaza. No one would have noticed, frankly. Also, it would have been tough to sleep on concrete, right, or brick. It was across the street from the Federal Reserve, one of the symbols of what was being protested. And furthermore, as something like 60,000 people a day emerged out of our principal train station, they encountered this protest. that seemed very important. So the extent that where Tahrir Square and South Boston, not South Boston, South Station are similar, that the protesters chose a place that would be visible and disruptive as a way, in part, to establish, kind of their mission. And I think that's as important as typology in predicting where things might happen.
Not to mention all those commuter eyeballs in the cars coming off the highway.
Absolutely right.
Liz,
Yeah, I just wanted to, Alex kind of picked up on this a little bit with the South Station comment. But I think it's important we've dealt with the issue of scale, that there's obviously something too big about the plaza. But let's not lose in the discussion the fact that people don't know what to do in the square. I think that's really important part of it. And when you look at these other places, the Tahrir Square, the roundabout, people were doing normal activities there. And I do think that, popular politics is going to come more naturally. Democratic interactions are going to happen more comfortably when people sort of are feeling like it is woven into their daily lives, into their daily interactions. So I do think it's not enough to shrink the size of the square. It has to be a place where normal life takes place. And to bring one of Saskia's points into this, where you're not surveilled, because there is a way now where you just feel like if you just walk through the center of it, you're surveilled. People actually walk around the edges so that they're not the center of all attention.
So they don't get knocked over by the wind.
Yeah, well, there's that, too. Can you do something with trees without that?
Briefly, there are 50 trees now. There are probably 3 that have a reasonable state of health. And we imagine that there may be 300 trees before long.
Okay, wow. That's good.
So just hold that thought. I want to acknowledge, I'm glad it just came up, that underneath this there is the kind of disciplinary professional fault line about ecological performance, the park as viz the other forms of urbanity that we are not touching on in this format. For many years, obviously, the Boston City Hall and its plaza have been a case study in the school. The MLA, the landscape students are now using it in their first year studio course. I know the environmental performance of that surface is now a topic in a way that it might not have been several decades ago. But we're not going to open it up to questions in the time that we have remaining.
Just one quick thought, and Elizabeth, I thought you were going to end up there, but you could naively, I could go further and say, I'm not sure that the American population knows how to occupy public space. If that space were in Mexico City, think of the Zocalo, that space wouldn't be big enough, and it would have the ambulant culture and characteristics that so many Latin American and Asian cities, quite frankly, have. So I've always thought about that space as something we Americans progressively know less and less about how to occupy to begin with.
Thanks for the statement. We're going to Neil Brenner.
So this ties in directly with what Chris just said, and this is really for Gerald. I mean, the broader context within which the kind of the legal maneuvering around private public space and so forth occurs, it seems to me, is one of really massive state repression of the attempt to kind of politically demonstrate. So increasing sort of militarization of policing and, kind of state strategies to not just surveil, but really, repress basic civil liberties. And so there's a broader, there's a political point here, but there's also a methodological one, which I think is a general challenge for the conference. Like, we obviously need to deal with the built environment and design. But that's not just a scale question. That's kind of a question of substantive focus. And Gerald can report on this in detail from the work that you've done. Like, the broader kind of legal, political, juridical context within which these design kind of debates occurs is really, really important to understanding the fate of the Occupy movement. So it's just kind of a plea that we bring that sort of that broader dimension in order to understand the particular fate of public space, at least in the case of Zuccotti Park. I mean, it's a context in which, years before demonstrations against the Republican National Convention were basically repressed through, all kinds of military policing. And that's occurring not just in the U.S., but more generally. And it seems to me that's extremely relevant to bring into a conversation like this without, on the other hand, losing the kind of nuanced focus on the local and on the design of public squares.
I would say this. It's a lot of people have viewed what happened with all of the Occupy movements as, ignoring the legal framework. The Occupy movements could have been disgorged from the spaces under extant law, other than, by the way, Occupy Wall Street. And by the way, I didn't show 2 slides that I had of Occupy London, which was removed about a week or so ago after a judicial decision, and also Occupy Boston, which was, again, removed after a legal decision. So the legal decisions clearly indicated that, whether it was a public or ultimately a private owner, you could remove these Occupy movements. But in fact, for a variety of reasons, we can talk about them, they had a lot of staying power. Interestingly enough. And they certainly weren't removed immediately, and they, in general, some people may disagree, but they weren't removed deeply violently.
Well, I cannot resist intervening, though I don't want to take away the time from it, since I've had my chance to speak. The issue about the state, the ambiguous role of the state, it picks up a bit on what Neil just said. That is a critical issue we need to confront. I think there are 2 things that are intersecting. On the one hand, we do not have a working liberal state, which means that the whole theory of liberalism is a bit undermined. Secondly, Germany, France, the UK, we are under a state of emergency, which is actually a draconian law which enables police forces. I mean, I think I mentioned it yesterday that the New York Police Department deployed its anti-terrorism unit in Zuccotti Park. Homeland Security sent its forces. So I really like the point that you made, this ambiguity. In liberal theory, the state is meant to protect public space for the citizens. Now, second point which came out of this discussion, which I thought was fascinating, the street. The street, the ordinary street. And I also think that a lot of what Zuccotti Park, I worked on that because it's a fascinating subject. I think a lot of it had to do with occupying is hard work, and in that occupying, they made the social, not the political. It is the making of social capabilities. And I think that in this current context, where the whole category of politics has become, let me put it kindly, ambiguous, this notion of making the social, making social capabilities becomes incredibly important. So the ordinary street, and some of the spaces, Rahul, that you also look at, not the square, the public square, the piazza, so to say. Anyhow, there's much more to be said, but I thought this was a great discussion.
Oh, I just wanted to say how happy I would be with the idea that it's social before it's political, and if you go too fast to the political, it's undermining. But a small thing with Gerald Caden, and it's implied by what Saskia Sassen just said. Consider this: for 1965 is Boston City Hall Square, exactly the same year that Robert Venturi published Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. We're talking about what to do about this square now. I disagree that there is no public appetite for public initiation, and I think we're partly because of Occupy Wall Street, and certainly because of the 1% and the 99%, and Saskia Sassen's statistics from last night. Neoliberalism is not going to be here too much longer.
You heard it first.
But
maybe I'll be dead before it's gone.
Well, not Canada.
Okay, Alex.
Not to dwell on whether neoliberalism was here to stay or not, but think about this for a second. I live in Boston in a normal neighborhood. We can have a block party almost any time we want to close off our street with one little permit from the local sort of police station. It's a social event. You need lots of permits and lots of bureaucracy to go to decide to host something in City Hall Plaza, because almost automatically becomes a political event. And I think that we have to somehow have a little bit of patience with this issue. If to some extent it does serve, at least symbolically, as the place for all, ironically, it has to undergo a certain kind of control, whereas on my block, I can just kind of go out there and put some lawn chairs on there Sunday, and no one will care very much except my neighbors who will enjoy it. So I think we have to make a distinction, another kind of typological distinction between the street, which is local, oftentimes, as opposed to broad or universal, versus the plaza, which somehow implies that it is kind of a, broadly public.
I'm just a little concerned before we go to our last question. I'm a little concerned that we keep wanting to have it both ways. I mean, on the one hand, there's an enormous slippage between questions of space, its production at least, and its typology, and questions of surveillance and repression and policing on the other. And I think we've established, even if it's a spectrum, a kind of slippage between the design of those spaces and what they avail themselves for in terms of political occupation. And yet we return to the street not for its expressly political dimension, right? And remember that we got to street, at least in the Baird schema, because it was available for a kind of distracted publicness, which I could then take from further discussion to be a kind of foundation for potential, if not community, at least sociability. And that seems at the same moment to have then led us to this sense that I'm a little concerned about, maybe it was my own conclusion only, well, if we simply had the ordinary street, that would provide us a more fertile ground for a more benevolent condition. And in fact, I want to return to the kind of pressing demands for environmental performance, on the other hand, as well as the slippage between the typology and its forms of occupation. I personally would be a little concerned if we leave us with the sense that, well, the street in its 19th century typology is really fertile ground for political action, unless I'm missing something.
Actually, the street is not now contested as much for political action, which will always be there, whether it's permitted or not. It's now being contested for all sorts of other uses above and beyond cars. And that's where there are very interesting contestations, whether it's bikes, and there are controversies everywhere about that, or even parklets, where we're going to actually create public space by taking over 2 parking spaces and creating little tiny parks that can be used for sort of nice, passive, recreational kinds of uses, or other kinds of actual insertions by the public sector. One of the most famous people in New York today is Janette Sadik-Khan. Why? Because not only is she promoting bicycling as opposed to traffic cars, but she's also putting down some chairs and other kinds of street furniture and creating out of the street actual public spaces that are not going to be used by cars. And it's a great irony to me. I've said here, not that I promote specially privately owned public spaces, but here are these actual spaces that don't have cars in them that we totally neglect and allow for privatization and other misuse. And we have to actually now take over the street for, plazas and arcades. I'm not against that. But I'm just saying it's an irony that we don't actually take advantage of all the public spaces, which are, by the way, not just large spaces, obviously, but can be very, very small across the spectrum.
Great. So the last word.
I want to make 2 further remarks on the peculiarity of the U.S. state. I think we're having a discussion about whether there are obstacles to democratic politics in the architecture of the built environment, when it seems to me that it's in the architecture of the state that the major obstacles are, and that we ought to relate the two. I was surprised about the discussion as to whether they should be commercial operators in public space. But the reality of the U.S. state is, according to Jacob Acker and others, is that the U.S. state operates with a mixed economy. Of every public good is provided by private operators. If you look at welfare, that's the case. If you look at healthcare, that's also the case. If you look at education, that's also the case. In fact, the only public good that's provided only by public providers is punishment in this country, notwithstanding the whole discussion about private incarceration and so on, which is a complete sideshow. And the second point is that hasn't there been a de facto confiscation of politics by operators who are not in public space, who are in private space, with the structural corruption of electoral politics? It was just announced yesterday that Obama has held his 100th fundraiser for the current presidential campaign. And my question would be, why would people want to go and demonstrate or occupy public space when democratic politics is happening behind closed doors? The space of democratic politics in America is the fundraisers where you go and you pay for play. So for me, I am surprised that, in a sense, that why would, my question would be not why aren't these public places used more? Why would people go and demonstrate? And why would they go in front of City Hall? That's not where the locus of power is today.
So we will leave it at that and leave the next panel. We will leave the next panel to address the status of Ben and Jerry's donation to Occupy.